In the spring of 1898, a managing editor named Frederick Hapgood walked into the offices of the New York Tribune and placed a memo on the desk of his section editor that he had spent the previous evening writing. The memo was 4 pages long. It documented a specific pattern he had been tracking for 18 months, a pattern in the Tribune's financial reporting in which coverage of specific industrial mergers, bond offerings, and railroad refinancing transactions had shifted in tone and emphasis in ways that correlated, in every case Hapgood had examined, with the financial interests of the Morgan banking house. He was not accusing anyone of deliberate corruption. He was documenting a pattern and asking his editor to review it with him. The editor read the memo. He told Hapgood he would look into it. He never raised the matter again. Hapgood left the Tribune within the year to work for a smaller Boston publication. Before leaving, he made a copy of the memo. The copy is in the Boston Public Library's rare manuscripts collection, donated by Hapgood's daughter in 1953. The file is catalogued. It has been cited once in a footnote of a 1971 dissertation on the history of American financial journalism. The dissertation was not published as a book. What Hapgood had documented in 1898 was one piece of a pattern that was considerably larger than a single newspaper in a single year. The relationship between the Morgan banking house and the American press in the final decade of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th is not a matter of historical inference. It is documented in the Congressional Record, in the Morgan banking house's own internal correspondence, in the testimony of editors and publishers who appeared before investigative committees, and in the specific, traceable changes in editorial content that followed specific financial transactions between the Morgan interests and the newspapers involved. Before we go further, if investigations like this are what you come here for, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what J.P. Morgan's relationship with the American press actually was, and why the documented record of that relationship has been treated by mainstream press history as a peripheral story rather than as a central one, we have to start with the scale of Morgan's financial presence in American media and with the specific congressional investigation that assembled the most comprehensive public account of it. In February of 1917, Congressman Oscar Callaway of Texas rose on the floor of the House of Representatives and read into the Congressional Record a statement that he had based on an investigation he and several colleagues had conducted into the ownership and editorial control of American newspapers. Callaway stated that in or around 1915, J.P. Morgan and Company had purchased editorial control of the 25 most influential newspapers in the United States. Not direct ownership in every case, but financial relationships, advertising agreements, loan arrangements, and in several cases direct stock acquisition that gave the Morgan interests effective editorial influence over what those newspapers published on financial, industrial, and political matters. Callaway stated that the purpose of this purchase of editorial influence was to ensure that American public opinion on specific questions, tariffs, railroad regulation, the role of the Federal Reserve, American involvement in the European War, developed in directions consistent with the financial interests of the Morgan banking house. Callaway's statement is in the Congressional Record for February 9th, 1917. It has been there for over 100 years. It has been cited by researchers studying the history of American media and financial power. It has not been the subject of any formal congressional investigation since the day it was read into the record. What happened to Callaway's statement after he read it into the record is its own story. The 25 newspapers he named as under Morgan editorial influence were, with one exception, the same publications that would have been responsible for covering his statement and determining whether the American public became aware of it. The coverage was minimal. The New York Times, which Callaway's investigation had named as one of the publications under Morgan financial influence, ran a brief item on the statement in its back pages. The major wire services did not distribute it widely. The story that a sitting congressman had documented the Morgan interests' editorial control of the American press was covered primarily by the small Labour and Reform publications that Callaway's named newspapers had every incentive to ignore. The mechanism that Callaway was describing was the same mechanism that suppressed the coverage of his description of it. The circularity was visible to anyone paying attention in 1917. It has been visible to every researcher who has examined the period since. It has not been the subject of formal investigation. The statement's specific claims require examination. Morgan's relationship with the American press was not a simple story of direct newspaper purchase. It was a complex and multi-layered financial relationship whose effect on editorial content was produced through mechanisms that were more difficult to trace than outright ownership. The most important of those mechanisms was the advertising relationship. By 1900, advertising had become the primary revenue source for American newspapers. The shift from reader subscription revenue to advertiser subscription revenue had fundamentally changed the economic relationship between newspapers and the commercial interests that advertised in them. A newspaper that depended on advertising revenue for the majority of its operating budget was financially dependent on the continued goodwill of its major advertisers in a way that a subscription-funded newspaper was not. The major advertisers in American newspapers by 1900 were the large industrial corporations, the railroads, the steel companies, the utilities, the consumer goods manufacturers, most of which had their primary financing relationships with the Morgan banking house. A newspaper that ran editorial content critical of a Morgan-financed corporation was running content that could be used to justify a reduction in advertising spending by that corporation. The reduction did not need to be explicitly threatened to be effective. The financial relationship made the threat implicit. Editors understood the dynamic. The memo Hapgood wrote in 1898 was a documentation of what that dynamic produced in practice. The mechanism worked both ways. Advertising revenue gave corporations leverage over newspapers, but the Morgan banking house operated as the primary source of capital for those same corporations, which meant that its influence extended through the advertising relationship by one additional step. A corporation whose primary financing relationship was with Morgan was financially dependent on maintaining Morgan's goodwill. Morgan's goodwill was, in part, a function of whether the press coverage of Morgan-financed enterprises was favorable. A corporation that placed advertising in a newspaper that ran hostile coverage of Morgan interests was implicitly placing advertising in a publication that was working against the corporation's primary financial relationship. The corporate advertising officer did not need to receive a phone call from the Morgan banking house to understand the implication. The structure made it self-enforcing. The editors knew it, the advertising managers knew it, the publishers knew it. The result was not a room full of people receiving explicit instructions. It was a room full of people operating within a financial environment in which the path of least resistance ran in the same direction as the path most beneficial to the Morgan interests. The direct financial relationships between the Morgan interests and specific newspapers are documented in the Morgan banking house's own records. The Morgan Archive, held at the Morgan Library in New York, includes correspondence and financial records covering the banking house's relationships with publishing interests. The archive has been examined by scholars and is accessible to qualified researchers. The specific correspondence relating to editorial relationships with specific newspapers has been noted by researchers who have worked in the archive. A comprehensive published analysis of those relationships, tracing the financial connections between the Morgan interests and specific newspapers, correlating the timing of those connections with documented changes in editorial content, and producing a systematic account of what the relationships produced, has not been published. The specific newspapers most directly connected to the Morgan financial network in the 1895 to 1920 period are identifiable from the Morgan Archive, from the advertising records of the relevant publications, and from the scholarship of media historians who have examined the period. The New York Times had a direct financial relationship with the Morgan interests beginning in the early 1890s when Adolph Ochs acquired the paper, an acquisition that required outside capital and that involved Morgan-connected financial backing. The Times' subsequent editorial posture toward the Morgan banking house and toward Morgan-financed industrial enterprises was noted by contemporaries as distinctly favourable, a posture that Hapgood's memo documented from the inside. The New York Tribune, whose financial backing was connected to the Whitelaw Reid family's commercial relationships with the Morgan network, followed a similar pattern. The New York Sun, owned by William Laffan, had documented advertising relationships with Morgan finance corporations that Callaway's investigation had identified as creating editorial conflicts. The editorial content of each of these publications in the period of the Morgan financial relationships compared to their content before those relationships were established and to the content of publications not in the Morgan network is analyzable from the archived editions of each paper. That analysis has not been conducted as a formal published study. John Swinton was a former managing editor of the New York Times who had resigned from that position in the 1880s after becoming convinced that the newspaper's financial entanglements had compromised its editorial independence. Swinton published a brief independent newspaper called John Swinton's Paper between 1883 and 1887 in which he addressed, with the specificity of an insider, the relationship between New York newspaper ownership and the financial interests of the commercial institutions that the papers covered. In 1883, at a banquet for the New York press, Swinton was asked to give a toast to the independent press of America. He declined to give the toast and gave instead a statement that was reported by the few publications willing to print it and suppressed by the rest. Swinton told his audience of newspaper editors that there was no independent press in New York, that every man in the room knew it, that their function was to lie and distort and to destroy the truth, and that if any man in the room attempted to publish honest opinions he would be out on the street looking for another job. He said the press was the tool and vassal of the rich men who sat behind it, and that their job was to destroy and steal, to lie, to vilify, and to sell their country and their race for their daily bread. His statement was not delivered in anger. It was delivered, by the accounts of those present, in the calm tone of a man describing what everyone in the room already knew. The statement was reprinted in several Labour and Reform publications in the years following. It has been cited by media critics and press historians. It has not been cited in any mainstream history of American journalism. A congressional investigation that is less well known than the Nye Committee, but equally significant to the question of press and financial power, is the Reece Committee investigation of 1953 and 1954, which examined the activities of major philanthropic foundations, including the Carnegie and Rockefeller foundations, and their influence over American educational and media institutions. The committee, chaired by B. Carroll Reece of Tennessee, produced findings that described the Foundation's influence over American public opinion formation as extensive, coordinated, and largely invisible to the public that was being influenced. The committee's research director, Norman Dodd, later described in interviews the specific findings about Foundation-funded influence over the major American newspapers and wire services. The committee's final report was published. Its findings were challenged by the foundations involved, were characterized by the mainstream press as extremist and conspiracy-minded, the same characterization used to discredit the Nye Committee, and were not acted upon by any subsequent legislative body. Dodd's interview, given in 1982 to a researcher named G. Edward Griffin, describes the specific documentary evidence the committee had assembled about Foundation influence over press content. Dodd states that the committee found internal Foundation documents describing a deliberate program to influence American public opinion through the editorial content of major newspapers, and that the documentary basis for this finding was specific and extensive. The Reece Committee's working papers are in the National Archive. They have been examined by researchers. They have not been cited in any congressional proceeding since the committee's work ended in 1954. The Morgan Banking House's archive at the Morgan Library has never been the subject of a formal congressional or regulatory subpoena requiring the production of its records relating to editorial relationships with specific newspapers, No formal investigation has been conducted into the claim Congressman Callaway made in 1917 that the Morgan interests had purchased editorial control of the 25 most influential American newspapers as using the subpoena authority that would allow a formal examination of both the Morgan archive and the archive of the newspapers named. The American press history establishment has never published a comprehensive account of the relationship between the Morgan banking interests and the editorial content of the major New York newspapers in the 1895 to 1930 period, despite the Morgan archive being accessible and the newspaper's archived editions being available for systematic content analysis. Why has the Congressional Record entry for February 9, 1917, in which a sitting congressman alleged that the Morgan interests had purchased editorial control of the 25 most influential American newspapers, never been the basis for a formal congressional investigation with subpoena authority over the relevant documents? Why is the most comprehensive account of the relationship between financial power and American press content in this period John Swinton's 1883 statement to a room of newspaper editors, a statement that the press he was addressing declined to publish, rather than a product of the institutional press history establishment that maintains the narrative of American journalistic independence? Why have the Reece Committee's working papers, which Norman Dodd described as containing specific documentary evidence of Foundation influence over major newspaper editorial content, not been examined in any formal proceedings since the committee's work ended in 1954, in the 7 decades during which the foundations and media institutions described in those papers have continued to operate? Why does the Morgan Library's archive of the banking house's relationships with publishing interests remain unexamined by any formal regulatory body in an era of unprecedented financial concentration in American media ownership? These questions do not go away because the Morgan banking house has reorganized and merged into J.P. Morgan Chase, or because the specific newspapers Callaway named in 1917 have changed ownership multiple times since then. The pattern Callaway described, financial interests using their economic leverage over advertising-dependent media to shape editorial content, is not a historical phenomenon that ended in 1917. It is the structural condition of American financial journalism. The specific financial relationships have changed. The structural mechanism has not. The mechanism was operating in 1898, when Frederick Hapgood documented it in a memo that his editor declined to act on. It was operating in 1917, when Oscar Callaway read his documented findings into the Congressional Record. It was operating in 1954, when the Reece Committee assembled documentary evidence of Foundation influence over editorial content, and the media ownership concentration that characterizes American journalism in 2024, in which the major financial and general interest publications are owned by private equity, hedge funds, and the personal fortunes of individuals whose primary financial interests are in the industries those publications cover, represents the same mechanism operating at a scale that would have been familiar to anyone who sat in the room when John Swinton gave his toast. Frederick Hapgood's memo is in the Boston Public Library on Boylston Street. The Congressional Record entry for February 9, 1917 is publicly available in every major research library in the country and online in the Library of Congress Digital Archive. The Morgan Banking House's archive is at the Morgan Library on Madison Avenue in New York, accessible to qualified researchers by appointment. The Reece Committee's working papers are in the National Archive in College Park, Maryland. Each of these documents is individually accessible. Each has been examined by at least one researcher. None of them has been connected to the others in a published account that assembles the full picture of what the Morgan interest relationship with the American press produced, why it was structured the way it was, and why the congressional and investigative efforts to formally examine it were each discredited and abandoned before they reached conclusions that could have produced accountability. The documentation is accessible. The account that connects it has not been published. These records survive because people refuse to stop asking. If this matters to you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is buried, it disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I am pulling a thread that connects the Morgan Press relationships of 1915 to the specific changes in New York newspaper editorial coverage of the Federal Reserve between 1913 and 1916, a period during which the newspapers most closely connected to the Morgan advertising network shifted from skeptical coverage of the new central bank to supportive coverage following a documented pattern whose timing correlates precisely with a series of large advertising contracts between Morgan-affiliated corporations and those newspapers. The advertising ledgers are in the newspaper archives. The editorial shift is visible in the archived editions. The correlation has been noted by one researcher in one footnote in one dissertation. It has not been published anywhere else.